I always knew living alone in the middle of the redwood forest would be an isolated experience. But I never imagined that one night I'd be sitting in the dark, hands shaking, convinced something was trying to get into my house. My small cabin is about 8 miles from the nearest town, a place called Orick, up in Northern California. If you've been around here, you know how massive the redwoods are. Trees so tall, your neck almost locks when you try to look up at the top. The road leading here is narrow and winding, and at night the darkness feels almost solid. It was a cold November night, around 10:30 p.m. I was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Sipping on a Folgers coffee I'd reheat it for the 3rd time in the microwave. Watching a rerun of The X-Files on TV, the fireplace was lit, but I could still feel the cold biting through the old window seals. The first sound came from far away, snap, like a thick branch breaking coming from the back of the house. It's not uncommon to hear sounds like that around here. Deer, raccoons, even black bears roam the area. But this time, it sounded heavy, slow. I paused the TV and listened. 2 more steps. The sound of wet snow and dry leaves being crushed. I grabbed my Maglite flashlight from the end table and walked to the back door. I looked through the glass, but all I saw was darkness reflecting my own face. I decided to open it just a crack to listen better. The cold air came in, along with that damp, earthy redwood smell after rain, but I didn't hear anything else. I shrugged it off and went back to the couch. Then came the second sound. This time it was closer. A slow knock on the side of the house, right below the kitchen window. It wasn't the light sound of a branch hitting from the wind. It sounded deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more. My heart started pounding. I thought about calling the Humboldt County Sheriff, but I didn't have anything concrete to report yet. Probably an animal, I told myself. Still, I grabbed the 12-gauge shotgun I keep behind the door. The fireplace crackled loudly, making me jump. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the front deck, creaking under the weight of something or someone. The sound was heavy. Measured 4 steps. Pause. 3 more. I froze. The front door handle began to turn, slowly, like someone was testing if it was unlocked. I swallowed hard. My finger was on the trigger. I shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. I went to the window next to the door and yanked the curtain aside quickly. The porch light was on. There was no one there. No shadow. No visible footprints. Then I noticed the porch light was flickering. Not a random bulb flicker. It was turning off for a few seconds, then back on. I'd changed the bulb just a few days ago. As I watched, the light went out for good. Darkness swallowed everything. That's when I heard the most chilling sound of the night. Breathing. Not mine, not the wind's. Slow, heavy breathing just outside the door. Without thinking, I called 911. The operator answered with that trained, calm voice. "-911. What's your emergency?" "Someone's trying to get into my house. I live on Forest Road 6 near Orick, in the Redwoods. They've already messed with my door." She told me to stay on the line and said a unit was on the way, but would take about 20 minutes. Out here in the middle of nowhere, 20 minutes feels like forever. While I was talking, I heard running footsteps on the deck and down the stairs. Then silence. The police arrived 23 minutes later. 2 officers knocked on the door and searched the perimeter with flashlights. They didn't find clear footprints, just blurred marks in the wet soil. No sign of forced entry. One of the officers, a guy named Miller, looked at me and said, "Could have been a bear. Sometimes they push on doors." But there was something in his tone that said he didn't really believe it. After they left, I locked every door, drew all the curtains, and stayed awake until dawn, shotgun by my side. I never saw or heard anything like that again. But every time I pass by the front door and see the deep scratch in the wood, I remember that someone or something was there that night. And to this day, I don't know why. I was driving west on Route 66, crossing the desert toward California. It was mid-July, and the sun felt like it was trying to burn through the windshield. I'd been on the road for hours, sipping on a warm bottle of Mountain Dew and listening to static-filled local radio stations. My plan was to make it to Barstow by nightfall, but around 8:30 p.m., I realized I was too tired to keep going. A few miles ahead, I saw a flickering neon sign that read, "Sunset Vista Motel Vacancy." It was one of those old roadside motels you'd expect to see in a faded postcard from the 1960s, long row of doors, each with peeling paint, a vending machine buzzing under a single yellow light. I pulled into the cracked parking lot. There were only 2 other cars, both covered in dust, like they hadn't moved in days. The air smelled like hot asphalt and sagebrush. Inside the front office, an older man with silver hair and a faded Dodgers cap looked up from behind the counter. "Just one night?" he asked, voice raspy like he'd smoked for 50 years. "Yeah, just passing through," I said. He slid over an actual brass room key with a plastic tag. "Room 6. Checkout S at 11. Ice machine S down the hall, but it's picky. Don't go banging on it after midnight." He chuckled a little, but there was something about his eyes that didn't match the smile. Room 6 was near the end of the row, the second to last door. The air conditioner rattled when I turned it on, blowing out air that smelled faintly like mildew. I took a quick shower, scrolled on my phone for a while, and by 11:45 p.m., I was half asleep. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on my door. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. The sound wasn't tentative. It was steady, like the person knew I was inside. I didn't move. After about 30 seconds, the knocking stopped. I waited another full minute before I got up and peeked through the blinds. The parking lot was empty except for the 2 dusty cars. I told myself it was probably a drunk guest at the wrong door. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time softer, almost like the knuckles were brushing against the wood. I didn't open the door. Around 2:15 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Slow, measured, pacing back and forth in front of my room. Then whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a man's voice. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" I kept my voice low. "I'm at the Sunset Vista Motel on Route 66 in Newberry Springs. Someone's outside my room, knocking and whispering. I'm alone." The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that a deputy was on the way. She asked me to describe the person, but I couldn't. I hadn't actually seen them. 5 minutes passed. The whispering stopped. Then came the sound of someone trying the door handle. Slow at first, then with more force. Da-da! I pressed my back against the wall, clutching my phone. Red and blue lights finally washed over the parking lot. San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy knocked a real clear knock this time and called out. I opened the door just enough to see his uniform. They searched the property. No one. The deputy told me there were no cameras on the building and no other guests had called in complaints. "Lock up tight," he said, shining his flashlight down the empty row of doors. These old motels, you never really know who's been hanging around. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When I checked out in the morning, I asked the man at the counter if he'd seen anything. He just looked at me for a long second, then said, "Room 6, huh? Should have put you somewhere else." I didn't ask what he meant. Got back in my car, pulled onto Route 66, drove toward Barstow with the sun rising behind me, and I never looked back. I've lived in Los Angeles for about 3 years now. I rent a small 1-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Glendale. It's not the kind of place you hear sirens every night, actually. It's the opposite. So most of my neighbors are retirees or people who've been living here forever. One of them was Mrs. Reynolds, my next-door neighbor. She was around 65, maybe 70, but still moved like she was younger. She had this bright red hair, obviously dyed-tanned, a habit of leaving her apartment door slightly open when she was home. She was friendly without being invasive, the kind of person you wave to when you're carrying groceries. Every once in a while, we'd have short conversations in the hallway, usually about the weather, traffic on the 5 freeway, or which store had the best deals on groceries. The last time I saw her was on a Thursday morning in late October. I remember because the Santa Ana winds had kicked in, and the air was dry enough to make your lips crack. I was leaving for work, and she was standing outside her door in a light cardigan, holding a small plastic bag of trash. She smiled and said, "Morning, hun. Watch out for that traffic on the 134. It's a nightmare today." I smiled back, told her to have a good day, and left. That night I got home around 7:30 p.m. and her door was closed. Nothing unusual, but the next day, the door was still closed. On Saturday, I noticed her mailbox was stuffed full flyers, letters, even a small package wedged halfway in. That's when I started feeling uneasy. By Sunday afternoon, I decided to knock. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. I told myself maybe she went on a trip to visit family. But then I remembered Sheedy once told me her only son lived in Arizona, and they were in tea on great terms. She'd also mentioned she didn't like traveling anymore. Called the building manager, Mr. Keller, a man in his late 50s, who wears the same faded Dodgers cap every day. Told him I hadn't seen Mrs. Reynolds in days and that her mailbox was overflowing. Sighed, said he'd check on her and promised to call me later. About an hour later, there was a knock at my door. It was Mr. Keller, looking pale. He said he'd knocked, called her name, and finally used his spare key. The apartment was empty. Not in the sense that she'd moved out, but empty, like no one had been there for days. Dishes in the sink, a half-empty cup of coffee on the counter, TV remote on the couch, slippers by the armchair. It looked like she'd just stepped out for a minute and never came back. Keller said he called LAPD. 2 officers came, both in their 30s. Both with that calm but firm demeanor cops have when they retrying not to freak anyone out. They asked me if I'd seen anything unusual. I told them no, but then I remembered something. On Thursday night, when I got home from work, I'd heard faint noises in the hallway, like someone walking quickly. I assumed it was just another neighbor, but now I wasn't sure. The cops took notes, asked for her son's contact info. Keller had it from her rental application, and told us they'd be in touch. That night I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate. I got up, peered through the peephole, nothing. But when I opened the door, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Reynolds' door was open. Just a crack. I pushed it gently, calling her name in a whisper. The apartment was dark. I didn't go inside, something in my gut told me not to. I just closed the door and locked mine. The next morning I told Keller about it. He swore he'd locked her place after the cops left. A week went by. Then 2. No word from the police, no sign of Mrs. Reynolds. Her son came once, cleaned out some of her clothes but didn't talk to anyone. One night, I passed by her apartment and thought I saw movement inside, just a shadow against the blinds. When I stopped to look, it vanished. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear slow footsteps in the hallway, stopping right in front of my door.